morning, my name is Georgina Gethin and you're very welcome to this presentation, Are our patients properly represented in wound care trials? For this presentation, I have no conflict of interest to declare. In understanding research and in understanding sampling and population, it's important to put it in context. The adult population in the European Union is just over 414 million, with those over 65 being about 84 million. We know from leg ulcer prevalence studies that approximately 1.3 million people in the European Union alone will have lower limb ulceration. This is likely to be higher given that some people self-manage and others may be accounted for in private practice, but a solid estimate of about 1.3 million people. In any research study, we have the population who are affected by the disease, and from that population we draw a sample upon which to conduct our research, with the intention of applying the results from that sample back to the population. So it raises three questions. First of all, how well do we know our population with venous leg ulcers? How eligible are they for randomized controlled trials in this disease entity being venous leg ulceration? And ultimately, how well do the results of these trials apply to those with venous leg ulcers? So in order to try and understand our population, we'll look at three different studies. One study in the United Kingdom, which looked at patients on the THIN database, which is a GP registry. So they looked at randomly selected 1,000 patients with wounds, and the age and sex matched those to 1,000 without wounds. So great strength in this because of the number, but also it allowed for all comers to be included. The average age of those with a wound was slightly higher at 69 versus those without a wound. And we can say that about 55% of those with wounds were female. Interestingly, the average BMI was slightly higher than the general population, being at 29. And this has been consistent in trials in venous leg ulceration. About 1 in 5 in both groups smoke. But worryingly and interestingly, almost 3/4 had an average wound duration of nearly 5 years prior to the start of the study. But an important finding was also that almost 100%, so 94% of those with the wound, had at least one comorbidity compared to 3/4 of the general population. So in the west of Ireland, we looked at describing the population further. So this was specific to those with venous leg ulcers, and it was patients attending leg ulcer clinics. So this study included 50 people with no indication as to who those 50 were. They were consecutively presenting patients. So consistent with the THIN database, 58% of them were female. The average age, however, was higher for women than for men. Now, we know that women have a longer life expectancy than men, but it starts to show that straight away there are differences if we start to look just based on gender. So women being older than men within these studies. But similar to the THIN database, 90% or at least almost 100% had at least one chronic illness. And this compares in Ireland anyway to only 55% of the general population. And the most frequent conditions people had were hypertension, musculoskeletal disorders and atrial fibrillation. All of them had at least one risk factor for chronic illness, and the number of risk factors was an average of 2.26. And the most frequent risk factors people had were being either overweight or obese, which accounted for almost 60%. Hypertension again comes to the fore, 60%. High cholesterol and restricted physical activity. So following these, we wanted to take perhaps a more global perspective. And again, trying to understand the population from which we draw our samples. So we looked at the profile of people with venous leg ulcers as reported in observational studies. So studies whose sole purpose was to describe the profile of people. And in this, 20 studies met our criteria. One of the first things that comes to the fore is that 13 of these studies, so 13 out of 20, were conducted in the European Union. And this is consistent throughout wound care research, and particularly venous leg ulcer research. The majority of it is from the European Union, and of that, the majority is from the United Kingdom. Given the size of the continent, it's interesting that only 2 studies are reported from North America, 3 from South America, only 1 from Asia, and 1 from Australia and New Zealand. The average age, again, it shows us we need to look at different factors. The average age in Asia was 47 years, compared to the European Union and the US, about 69 years, consistent with our other studies. The female to male ratio was about the same, so 1.2 to 1, but actually in Asia, only 10% were female. Ethnicity is an area that has been under-recognised and under-reported, and only 1 study has actually reported on this. And in that study, 76% were Caucasian or white. We looked at the size of ulcers, and we took a weighted mean, which was 25.7 centimetres square, with a median much lower of 6.6. But the average duration, again, is quite long. It's over 1 year at 13.8 months in the European Union, but far, far longer at 65.5 months in South America. Other factors that would help us understand the profile of people with venous leg ulcers is very poorly reported across all of the studies. So only 1 study, for example, reported on the nutritional status, 3 on the mental health status, and when they did that, they used all sorts of scales. So they did a depression scale, quality of life scale, mini mental scores, all sorts of scales. Only 1 study reported on the medications that people were taking, and no study amongst the 20 that we identified provided a full, complete picture of this population. And factors that influence healing are poorly reported. And we concluded from these studies that women over 65 years of age, overweight or obese with multiple comorbidities and a high risk for cardiovascular disease were the most commonly cited. So it asks the question, therefore, what do we really know about the population from which we draw the sample? There's very little that we can say for certainty, and this certainty will change based on the part of the world that we take our sample from. We know that we can say with a high degree of confidence it affects more females than male, particularly in the over 65 group. Average age will differ based on gender and world location, but in the European Union it is an average of 65 to 77 years. The average wound size is 13 to 26 centimetres square, and the average duration is 1 to 2 years. All patients will have at least 1 comorbidity, of which hypertension is the most common, and we know that about 1/3 are obese. The majority of studies are from Europe and the United Kingdom, and therefore it's argued that we have a very poor understanding of diversity within this population and therefore within the samples upon which we study. And diversity, what I mean by that is diversity in terms of culture, healthcare systems, comorbidities, ability, geographical background, age, socioeconomic background, or ethnicity or race. So we went further and we tried to understand that within the trials that have been conducted, how well are the factors that affect generalizability reported? And bearing in mind that the consort statement which requires and recommends reporting of such factors, is over 20 years old, and all major journals have signed up to this statement. So we therefore looked at the external validity of randomised controlled trials in interventions in venous leg ulceration. We included 144 randomised controlled trials, and it's the largest study that we know of that has done such an analysis. What has to be said about these trials is because of the nature of the original question that was asked, they had to have assessed the wound bed. So a trial, for example, that only looked at healing versus not healed would not have been included. So it's not representative of all trials. Remember at the start where I said that about 1.3 million people in the European Union are affected by venous leg ulcers. The median sample size across these 144 studies was only 75, with a mean of 99. And what is obvious is that we are continuing to do small trials, and therefore the generalizability of those findings has to be questioned. We found almost 1,500 exclusion criteria listed, and we categorised these into various groups. So 29% were excluded because of something with their wound, 42% were excluded because of something to do with the perhaps comorbidities, and we categorised them then according to precision, safety, ethics and administrative. But what was interesting, even in trials in the last 5 to 10 years, was how vague some of the statement were around who were included or excluded. One trial, for example, said all patients with conditions likely to affect healing were excluded. But anything can affect healing. Mobility, access to healthcare could affect healing. So it allowed almost like a subjective assessment of who would be in or not within a trial. ABPI, which is recommended in many guidelines for venous ulcer management, it's not a requirement in many of them, but it's often recommended, was used as an exclusion criteria in 71%. But interestingly, it was written in 14 different ways. And about 60% of the studies excluded people who had an ABPI of 0.8, which meant that 40% included those people, with one trial including people with an ABPI of 0.65 in a trial for venous leg ulceration. Age was reported by 94%, gender 89%, of which 56% were female. Ethnicity was reported in 13%, which is a little bit better than our previous work, and it showed that 74% were white. Only 42% reported on comorbidities and 4% on medications. Most recorded wound size, which given our criteria was understandable, and the average mean, the weighted mean of wound size was 13.2 centimetres square. Just over 3/4 reported on duration, and the weighted mean was 22 months, almost 2 years. So we're getting a picture of wounds having a duration of 1 to 2 years, not being unusual. So why is all of this important? If we take one example, for example, hypertension, we know that about 60% of the adult population have hypertension. We also know that approximately 60% of those with venous ulcers have hypertension. We don't know within that how many have well-controlled hypertension. But, and this is important, prevalence and management of hypertension varies by ethnicity, race, and other factors, which may include, for example, access to healthcare. Yet, a factor such as ethnicity is not considered in the design or reporting of the majority of venous leg ulcer trials. So therefore, one has to ask the question, can our trials be truly generalisable? To start, we said we have about 1.3 million people within Europe, and I use Europe as an example. So if we know from our population, our sample, we're getting a picture of predominantly female, over 65, who is obese, who may be obese, with at least one comorbidity. And therefore, are those results truly applicable, for example, to a male under 65 black, living in New York City. And it's put very eloquently in a recent blog post by Sean Triuk of Trial Forge, in which he said, if a trial does not represent those in the community who could benefit, then it is a failed trial. If we as researchers ignore large sections of the population we seek to serve, we should not be surprised if they in turn ignore the inadequate evidence that we generate. So it's certainly putting it to us. So to finally say some of the challenges we have ahead, healing outcomes have plateaued at around 60% after 12 weeks in venous leg ulcers. If we want to improve our understanding of the 40% who do not heal, we must consider ethnicity and diversity in the design and the reporting of our trials. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.